Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. I'm Dave from Chase Summit, and today we're going to be taking a look at the brand new Polar Vantage V2. By the way, I couldn't do the beard anymore. The Polar Vantage V2 joins Polar's multisport lineup above the Polar Vantage M and Polar Grit X. This is Polar's flagship device currently and the most expensive option in their lineup. The Polar Vantage V2 is basically a culmination of all of the features that they've come up throughout all of their watches, and they've tried to squeeze it all into one watch. The original Polar Vantage V was wildly popular with triathletes, runners, and cyclists alike, and the Polar Vantage V2 aims to improve on some of the shortcomings of the original Polar Vantage V. Polar sent me this Polar Vantage V2 early for review. I've got a pretty good idea of what this does well and what it doesn't do so well, and I think I have a good basis to share my opinion with you. This is not a sponsored video. Polar did not pay me to make any of this, and all of the opinions in this video are my own. One important thing to note is this is a beta unit. It did not come in a retail box, so there will be no unboxing in this video. This basically showed up in a Ziploc bag with a charger, and that was about it. I think the firmware in here is production worthy. I could be wrong, so take that for what it's worth. I've been wearing the Polar Vantage V2 for a little over 2 weeks now. Day in and day out, I've been working with it, running with it, sleeping with it, training with it, doing all the things to get an idea of how it works in day-to-day life. There's going to be a lot of information in this video, so buckle up and let's get into it. By the way, if you found this video to be helpful or entertaining, make sure you hit that thumbs up button down below. It really means a lot to me, and consider subscribing so you don't miss more videos like this in the future. As you can see here, the Polar Vantage V2 has a super premium looking design. It is made out of all aluminum. There's no plastic here, except for like a little ring in here, but it's kind of a design accent. The Polar Vantage V2 comes in 6 different colors, and that's great to see. At least you get some options. The one I have here is the gray and lime green model, and I kind of dig this. I've gotten a lot of compliments on this while I've been wearing it. One common complaint I always saw from Polar Vantage V users is that the strap was super hard to remove if you want to swap it out for a new one. Polar has actually changed this design to have a little pin that you can pull out with your thumbnail, but I tell you what, I've been having a hard time getting this thing out. That said, the included band is really nice on this watch. It's super comfortable. I have not had an issue with it, and it does come in 2 sizes. You get small, medium, and medium large for different size wrists. The Polar Vantage V2 is 47 millimeters in diameter and about 13 millimeters thick and weighs in at just 52 grams, so it's super light. Even though it is 47 millimeters in diameter, which is kind of big, it feels really small thanks to the design and the rounded edges around the bezel. Just for a quick size comparison here, I've got some competitors in the same price range. We've got the Garmin Forerunner 745, we've got the Polar Grit X, we've got the Coros Apex Pro, we've got the Garmin Forerunner 945, and finally we've got the Polar Vantage V2. And you can see, even by the looks of it, the Polar Vantage V2 looks smaller, even though dimensionally it's pretty similar. The buttons on the Polar Vantage V2 are very tactile and clicky. I like how they're nice and wide. They're not just a round button, they actually have some surface area to them. Around the back of the Polar Vantage V2 is the Precision Prime 2.0 heart rate sensor, and this is the exact same heart rate sensor that you'll find on something like the Polar Grit X. The Polar Vantage V2 shares the same proprietary charger as the Polar Grit X in the original Vantage series. It's a magnetic little cradle that clips onto the back of the watch just like this. And of course, the Polar Vantage V2 is waterproof to a depth of 100 meters. The display on the Polar Vantage V2 is almost exactly the same as the Polar Grit X. It's a 1.2-inch transflective display. This is an always-on display, but it's not super vibrant or bright like a Apple Watch or something like that. It's more similar to something like a Garmin, a Coros, a Suunto, where it's super readable in direct sunlight, but in the dark you need a backlight to read it. The backlight of the Polar Vantage V2 is gesture-based, and it's also got a button. So how this works is basically when you raise your wrist, it will turn on dimly. This dim setting is actually set by an ambient light sensor that's at the top of the watch here. When you press the dedicated backlight up here, it actually goes to full brightness. This works totally fine, but I do wish there were settings for both scenarios, like if I wanted to have it at 100% all the time. You can't really tweak the settings at all. They basically are what they are. The Polar Vantage V2, just like the Polar Grit X, has Corning Gorilla Glass. It is scratch resistant, but it's not scratch proof by any means, so you have to be kind of careful with it. If you've used a Polar watch before, like the Grit X, the Unite, the Ignite, or the original Vantage series, you'll be right at home here in terms of the user interface. It's very similar to those watches with a few tweaks. Basically, you've got this watch face, and now the watch face is actually somewhat customizable. As you can see here in the settings, I've got an option for digital or analog, and if I click digital, I've got 3 options for digital, and I think there's 3 options options for analog as well. Basically, these are like little themes for your watch face. You can't really add anything more like you have an option to on like an Apple Watch or a Garmin, but it's nice to see that they're actually pushing for some customization here. The menu system's a little weird for the watch face because you have a watch face setting in the general settings, but then you also have this watch face view setting that's part of the main menu system. And if you click in here, you can enable or disable different aspects of your watch face. Basically, if you want to hide the time from the watch face, you can uncheck it here and then hit save, and there'll be no time on your watch face. Not sure why you'd want to do that, but at least you have the option now. From the main watch face, you can swipe left or right, and basically when you swipe right, you go through your training load, training status, your current heart rate and averages. You've got your last training session, which was 3 days ago for me. You've got your nightly recharge here. You've got the FitSpark widget, which can give you recommendations on workouts to do that complement your last workout, your recovery, and your sleep. This is actually pretty cool, and it's great for people who are kind of new for training and maybe you're training for a marathon or something. Swiping over again drops you into the weather widget, and this seems like it's slightly updated than what the Polar Grid X has. You've got a graphic display of the current weather along with the temperature, and as you scroll down, you get a lot more information, including an hour-by-hour forecast with the wind direction and temperature. Swiping over again brings you to your weekly summary widget. My weekly summary this week isn't too great because I'm tapering for a race, so I've only got 32 minutes of working out this week. And if you click into your weekly summary widget, you can scroll down and you can see all of the stats for your week, including your heart rate zones and a whole bunch more information. And this is pretty cool to see. This is a brand new widget. It's not on any of the other Polar watches at this current time. Clicking the lower left button on the watch brings you into the main menu system where you can start a training session. You can do breathing exercises. You can see your Strava Live segments that you've brought over from Polar Flow and synced with the watch. You can customize a fueling strategy, and this is actually pretty cool. Fuelwise is a nutrition reminder for long activities like ultramarathons or Ironmans. You can set up a manual carb interval, so this basically just reminds you to take in some carbs every hour or so, or whatever you want to set it to. Or you can let the watch use some smarts and give you reminders based on how much calories and carbs it thinks you're using at a given time. I've used Fuelwise a couple of times with the Polar Grid X, and it can be really handy to remind you to take in a goo, because sometimes you just forget to when you're 8 hours into a race. And then below that, we've got tests, and this is brand new for the Polar Vantage V2. You've got the orthostatic test, which is a test to gauge how recovered your body is from your last activity. The next test is the leg recovery test, and this one's pretty interesting. Basically, it tells you to stand straight up with your hands on your hips, and then it tells you to jump as high as you can from a standing position. You jump 3 times, and then it takes that data from how high you jumped to come up with a metric on how recovered your legs are. I'm not exactly sure how they're using this information, but it's a pretty interesting tool, and I'm interested to see how it works over time. Below that, you've got a couple of fitness tests. You've got one for cycling, which I haven't tried yet, and then you've got one for running. The running test basically tells you to run at a certain pace for a certain amount of time, and then after a certain amount of time, it'll tell you to speed up a little bit, and it'll keep speeding you up until you can't hang anymore. Basically until you hit your max heart rate. And then below that, we've got the standard fitness tests, which you'll find on any of the other Polar watches. I haven't been lab tested, so I don't really know. I should probably get lab tested for these videos. So all of these tests and data are actually synced over to the Polar Flow ecosystem, and that's where you can actually plot a trend line to see how your fitness is improving or decreasing over time. Polar has listened to everybody's complaints and incorporated a few new smartwatch features, including a music player. Basically, if you swipe up from the bottom of the screen, you see this little music player, and this will control any music on your phone from Spotify, Google Play Music, YouTube Music. Keep in mind, this is not music storage, so you still need to have your phone with you to listen to the music. Swiping up again from here, it brings you over to your notification tray. I don't have any here right now, but here's where you see like Facebook messages, text messages, notifications from Instagram. These notifications work just fine, but I do wish Polar would have some sort of like calendar, maybe some more integration with your phone to make it a bit more smart. The Polar Vantage V2 also collects everyday wellness data like steps and active time and calories burned. The Polar Vantage V2 will also collect your sleep data. They give you a sleep score every morning when you wake up to give you an idea of how good your sleep was for the night before. It's really interesting stuff, and they probably do it the best out of any of the brands I've tried. All of this sleep data is of course synced over to Polar Flow to break it down even further. The Polar Vantage V2, just like all Polar devices, comes pre-configured with a whole bunch of activities built in. You've got things like running, trail running, cycling, but you've also got really unique things like soccer or badminton and, figure skating. They've tried to cover basically any activity you can think of, and if you've got something really unique, you can set up a custom activity to track it within Polar Flow. Here you can see I've got my trail running activity, and if I click go, It says recording started, and then I've got my data pages. Data pages can have up to 4 fields at a time, and you can fully customize what these fields are and what they look like. Cycling through the pages, you can use the buttons on the side here. And when I get to the last page, you can see that the music player is actually available within the activity. One major quirk I still have with the Polar Vantage V2 and all of the other Polar watches is that notifications get automatically turned off when you're in an activity. So if I'm out on a long run and my wife texts me, I won't get that notification on my wrist. Still have to dig my phone out of my pocket to read what she said, and that's a huge problem for me. The Polar Vantage V2 comes pre-configured for GPS and GLONASS out of the box, but it does support QZSS and Galileo. The Polar Vantage V2 is also, of course, compatible with Bluetooth external devices like the Stride FootPod or chest-based heart rate sensors. Something that's always been a pain point for me with Polar watches is the navigation features. So on the Polar Vantage V2, you have access to navigation via a GPX file import or Komoot navigation. Komoot navigation is basically a third-party software that you can install on your phone. You can create routes within Komoot, and then you can sync them over to Polar Flow and then into the watch. Unfortunately, this navigation is super limited. Basically, it's just a map view. You can't zoom in on it, you can't pan around on it, you can't get a big picture of what your map looks like. It's just a straight line and an arrow following it. If you go off course, it will tell you that you're off course, but it's just not that packed with features. It's got a back to start function just like the Polar Grid X. However, when you click that, it just gives you an arrow aiming at the beginning point of your run or ride, which is not all that useful. It should be routing you along the route that you took to get to your given point instead of just telling you where you were when you started. Because if you're on top of a mountain, you can't really just jump off the side of a mountain and into the valley to get back to your car. I mean, that's not really what this watch is designed for anyways. That's kind of what the Grid X is for, but that doesn't do it either. So once you complete your activity and sync it over to Polar Flow, you have access to Training Load and Recovery Pro. These are two fantastic tools for training. Training Load Pro separates your cardio load from your muscle load and your perceived load. This is designed to give you a better idea and a bigger picture to how your body is reacting to increased volume in your training. This is by far one of the most comprehensive training load tools that you'll find on any platform of any watch. In terms of battery life, with the Polar Vantage V2, you can expect up to 1 week on a charge in smartwatch or standby mode. This is actually improved from the Polar Grid X that only got about 4 days on a charge, so I'm glad to see that they squeezed a little bit more out of it, even though the guts are pretty similar. A week is still kind of limited compared to the competition, but it's not bad. And that 1 week does include continuous heart rate tracking from the wrist-based heart rate sensor, and if you want to extend your battery life, you can disable all-day heart rate monitoring, you can turn it off completely, or there's actually a setting to only have it on at night while you're sleeping. You get a huge amount of battery life. It goes on for a couple of weeks rather than just a week. For activity tracking, you get a whopping 40 hours of GPS on time for recording your runs or rides, and that is with heart rate monitoring turned on from the wrist-based sensor. That's great for ultra marathons or Ironman events. You can go on for a really long time without worrying about the charge of your watch. The Polar Vantage V2 can also collect running power metric right from the wrist itself without an additional sensor, just like the Polar Vantage V and the Polar Grid X, and it works just as well as on those devices. I've been getting pretty good numbers, and we'll take a look at the data in a little bit. Here we're looking at a GPS track of an out and back run. I like to do out and back runs for GPS tests because in a perfect world, if I was on the same side of the road, I ran down the road and ran back the same way, all of the lines should be right on top of each other. So if they're all over the place, we know that watch is having a hard time getting a lock. So we're looking at the Polar Vantage V2 in orange, the Garmin Forerunner 945 in blue, the Coros Apex Pro in maroon, and the Stride Pod, which is actually my phone, in pink. So there's a lot of lines here, so let's zoom in a little bit to get a better idea of what's going on here. So as you can see here, the Polar Vantage V2 and the Garmin Forerunner 945 seem to be doing the best job here in terms of GPS accuracy. They are the closest to being on the road and being on top of each other because it's an out and back as possible. At certain points, it seems like the Garmin Forerunner 945 is doing a little better, and then in other areas like here, it seems like the Polar Vantage V2 is doing better. The Coros Apex Pro is doing a decent job as well, but not as good as the Polar Vantage V2 or the Garmin Forerunner 945. And then you've got my phone in last place because it's a phone and it was in my back pocket, didn't have great exposure to the sky, doing the least best job here. As a whole, I think the Polar Vantage V2 is doing a pretty good job in terms of GPS accuracy. It's as good as my Garmin Forerunner 945. All right, let's take a look at the heart rate data coming out of the Polar Vantage V2. For this comparison, I've got the Polar Vantage V2 in red, the Garmin Forerunner 945 in purple, and the Garmin Forerunner 945 was paired to the Garmin HRM Pro chest strap, and we should use that as a baseline for comparison. And I've also got the Coros Apex Pro here using the wrist-based optical heart rate rate sensor. So right off the bat, we can see that there's a little dip at the beginning. We'll zoom in on that. And most of these optical heart rate sensors have a hard time coming up to speed from a cold start. And that's the case here with the Coros Apex Pro. You can see that the Garmin Forerunner 945 with the chest-based sensor comes up to speed pretty quick here. There's actually a little dip that's kind of weird. And the Polar Vantage V2 actually follows it pretty good. It might actually be more accurate than the chest sensor here because I don't know what that dip's all about. While the Coros Apex Pro kind of lags behind and then eventually comes up to speed. And once it's up to speed, it settles and it becomes pretty accurate here. Zoom back out and zoom in on another area. All right, so here's where I started to see the dreaded issue I had with the Polar Grid X after a few runs. There are some spikes in the Polar Vantage V2's data. This is totally unexplained. The watch was super tight on my wrist. Nothing was weird here. It was on a wrist by itself. I didn't have an additional device on the wrist with it. They're only momentary. It doesn't last for a very long time. And it's weird because these spikes tend to happen at the end of runs, like after you're in it for a half an hour or so. Not to say that this heart rate trend line is bad. It's far from bad. It's actually really good, but it will screw up your max heart rate value. And if that's something you're interested in after your run, then that might be an issue for you. All right, so the final metric I want to look at and compare is the running power metric coming out of the Polar Vantage V2. A simplified way of explaining what running power is basically the measurement of energy coming out of your foot while you're pushing off the ground during running. This is typically measured in watts, just like a light bulb. Before we look at this graph, I want to remind you that running power is not a standardized metric. It's not something that can be calibrated into any device right now, and all of these brands and manufacturers are doing it a little bit differently. That said, I've come to rely on the Stride Pod here for consistency and giving me pretty accurate results. I've got the Garmin Forerunner 945 in blue, of course paired with the HRM Pro chest strap. I've also got the Polar Vantage V2 in orange, and then finally I've got the Stride Pod in red. And you can see here that the trend lines from all these devices look pretty similar, but the numeric values of them are off from each other. The Garmin's always a little bit high, the Stride Pod's a little bit low, and the Polar lands somewhere in the middle. All right, so let's zoom in on some of these areas and compare what's going on here. So you can see there's a spike in effort here, and all three of the devices react differently. The Garmin is definitely more exaggerated, where the Stride Pod is a bit less exaggerated. And again, the Polar lands kind of in the middle here, and that's a trend you'll see throughout the remainder of this. You can see here that I probably stopped to walk for a little bit, and all three devices drop pretty low. I think all three of these devices are totally usable for running power. However, I think the Stride Pod probably is a bit more consistent. I think the Polar Vantage V2 is doing a bit better of a job than the Garmin 945 with the HRM Pro chest strap. And again, I'll talk about this in every Polar video because I really like it. One big benefit about buying a Polar watch like the Polar Vantage V2 is that you get access to the Polar Flow ecosystem. The Polar Flow ecosystem is super comprehensive. They have a fantastic phone app as well as a web environment. Like you can see here, when I analyze one of my runs, you can see that the web environment is really well laid out. They give you a ton of information that you can scroll through, graphs and tons of data. You've got your splits down below. I'm not going to dive too deep on the Polar Flow ecosystem, but I generally really like it. All right, so what are my final thoughts on the Polar Vantage V2 as a whole? Should you get one? Who's it for? There's a lot to like about the Polar Vantage V2. It looks great. It's very comfortable. It's well built. It feels premium. I'm getting solid GPS accuracy and okay heart rate accuracy with an asterisk in the corner there. I'm getting solid running power data. I've got access to the awesome Polar Flow ecosystem. The wellness and sleep tracking and all that stuff is just top notch. They do it the best, I think. And finally, the new running tests on the Polar Vantage V2 are pretty interesting. All that being said, it's not all perfect. The interface is a little bit laggy. Not having notifications during activities really is annoying to me. Heart rate data, while being good, has those spikes that kind of throw me off and I don't really understand them. The standby battery life is still a little lackluster compared to the competition. And finally, the price. The Polar Vantage V2 comes in at $499, and that is a very competitive place to be in terms of price point. All of the watches I have in front of me right now are in that $500 price range. Overall, I'm pretty excited about the Polar Vantage V2 and what it has to offer with the new metrics and testing built into it. But at that price point, they've got a lot to compete with. So what do you think? Are you going to pick up a Polar Vantage V2? And if you are, what part of it excites you? All right, folks, that's all I've got for today. That's my quick review of the Polar Vantage V2 and what I think about it so far. If you are interested in picking up this watch or any of the watches I've shown here, I will link them all down in the description. Those links will help support my channel and they will cost you nothing. If you found this video helpful or entertaining, please give me a thumbs up down below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more videos from me in the future. And if you've got a particular question about the Polar Vantage V2, make sure you comment down below and let me know, and I will definitely get back to you. All right, I think I'm done now. I'll see you next time.